very bad dream last night. In the dream I was surrounded by plastic dinosaurs and dead trees. They pranced around me and threw red flowers in the air. As the flowers hit the ground, they changed colour and faded into a more pastel blue. This went on for some time. I looked at my hands and saw that they were lemons. I hate the taste of lemons. I looked at my hands again and they returned back to lemons, but they had several deep gouges in them. They burned. I started sinking into the ground. Then I woke up, fell off my bed, and landed in the grass. I started walking backwards.
I had a very bad dream last night. In the dream I was surrounded by plastic dinosaurs and dead trees.
They passed around me and threw red flowers in the air. As the flowers hit the ground, they changed colour and faded into a more pastel blue. This went on for some time. I looked at my hands and saw that they were lemons. I hate the taste of lemons. I looked at my hands again and they returned back to lemons, but they had several deep gouges.
saw the hellbound ship's black sails against the yellow Indies sky, and knew again the stench of powder, and men's brains, and war. The heads nailed to its prow looked down, those with eyes, gull-eaten, salt-caked, liplessly mouthing, no use. All's lost. The waves about me were scarlet, foaming, horribly warm, yet still the freighter's hideous crew called out, more blood. More blood. Its tar-streaked hull rolled over me. In despair I sank beneath those foul, pink billows, offering up my wretched soul to Almighty God, His mercy, and His judgment. Waking from nightmare, I found myself upon a dismal beachhead, amongst dead men and the pieces of dead men. My friend lay nearby. Birds were eating his thoughts and memories. In hell, at least the gulls are contented. For my part, I begged that they should take my eyes, thus sparing me further horrors. Unheeded, I stood in the surf and wept, unable to bear my circumstances. Eventually, tears ceased. My misfortunes were small, I was alive. And I knew that life had no worse news to offer me. I had a sudden memory of clinging fast to someone through the tempest. The figurehead lay at my feet, blindfolded by seaweed. Alone upon that dreadful shore, she smiled. I made to take the ribbon of kelp from off her painted eyes, then thought better of it, not wishing her to suffer the terrible distractions of that grim tideline. It was all I could do for her, though she had borne me through seas of blood, though her cold, wooden breast had nourished me in the heart of the storm. Her damp embrace had prevented me from drifting beyond reach, yet this small comfort was all I could offer. I could not love her as she had loved me. That night, I slept badly beneath cold, distant stars, pondering upon the cold, distant God in whose hands the fate of my home rested. Was he really there? Had he been there once, but now departed? The morning sun found me no more wise, no less troubled. Further down the shore, several of the beached corpses had become inflated by gas. I set about burying the sodden carcasses, matching odd limbs as best I could. With them, I buried all hope for my family's survival. Using driftwood, I began a pit, deep and wide. I had never seen nor imagined so many dead people. Noon came and went. By dusk, the crater was deep enough and I commenced hauling those cold, maimed, wretched things into the bed I had prepared. Dragging and cursing, I hoped my wife and daughters might be tucked by gentler hands when their turn came. I began to weep again. Dear God, who would protect them? The freighter was almost upon them. Who would care for them, now I was gone? Exhausted, I slept atop the grave, dreams ringing with the horribly familiar screams of children. I saw the black freighter bearing down on all I loved. But I was powerless to stop it. My home and family were doomed, my world reduced to ruin. Fate had dealt its hand casually, despite my bitter protestations. The same waves gnawed my island and home alike, yet swimming would surely be madness. It was then I conceived of building a raft. Although inwardly I doubted it would float. The island's trees did not look buoyant enough to reach home. Not unaided. Suddenly, I recalled the bloated stomachs of the buried men, then shuddered at the idea I found myself considering. I attempted to banish this repulsive notion. But it would not let me be. Finally approaching the shallow grave, I began digging. My scheme was loathsome, but I had no choice. Not when I considered the nature of my situation. Everything I loved, everything I lived for depended upon my reaching a home in advance of that terrible freighter. Clinging to the memory of my wife's eyes, I dragged men up from underground, sand trickling from their sockets. Removing their clothing, I tore it to ribbons, binding them together. Occasionally, I would pause in my work, entranced by the startling beauty of a tattoo or the enigma of an old scar. By afternoon, I felled enough young pops to build the deck of my conveyance, affixing it to the human float beneath. Satisfied, I waited for dusk and ebb tide, then embarked, heading east. East, across the night seas. East, borne on the naked backs of murdered men. With dawn came the gulls, drawn to the carrion upon which my transport rested. Led speed by my hunger, I was able to rip one from the air. I had not eaten since the shipwreck. Stomach filled with raw meat, dull blood caked upon my chin, I drifted on towards home. I knew it was there. Nothing would take it from me. There was a gull in my stomach. As the sun clambered precariously over the world's slippery rim, the enormity of my savage breakfast struck me and I grew faint. I'd swallowed too much bird flesh. I'd swallowed too much horror. Everything tilted. Above, scavengers wheeled hungrily, just screams dressed as feathers. The gull slaughterhouse chorus afforded no distraction from my nausea, and I fell, retching, to my knees between my raft's timbers. My friend stared up at me. This sudden confrontation with mortality induced an odd clarity within me. Lightheaded, I gazed into the inverted world beneath, where drowned gulls circled. A madman with blood-caked lips gazed back at me. His eyes, his nose, his cheeks seemed individually familiar, but mercifully I could not piece them together. Not into a face I knew. During the afternoon, I dozed fitfully, my enemy's hideous banner flipping dismally in my dreams. That death's head banner, IT flies above us all. And the heads nailed to the ship's black prow, those heads are our heads. Truly, whoever we are, wherever we reside, we exist upon the whim of murderers. I awoke at dusk and drank a little salt water. I have heard that on less than a pint daily, a man might survive. Beneath my raft, something moved. Irrationally, my first thought was of the corpses, bursting their bonds, attempting to clamber up into the air and dryness, but no. Something had brushed beneath me. My platform lurched again. Ahead, In the darkening water, I heard a splash. Shadowy forms approached. Were they boats come to rescue me? No. Not boats. Fins. Hades is wet. Hades is lonely. Teeth that seemed to move independently of the lips tore at my raft supports. Tiny prehistoric eyes glistened, seeming mad with rage even in repose. Whatever was beneath my boat commenced a violent thrashing, almost spilling me amongst the gnawing horrors. I clung to my mast as the platform tilted further. The water began to boil wild. Something was surfacing. How shall I describe it? It was massive, like no shark I'd ever heard tell of, with skin neither black nor wholly white, but a pale and mottled yellow. Further, IT was entangled in my ropes. Terrified lest it should resubmerge and drag me with it, I fell to my knees clutching a splinter of mast that had snapped off in my hand. The shark-stained marble eye looked up at me. And, in that instant, we knew each other. Half blind, half dead, wholly deranged by agony, the yellow leviathan attempted to swim away, dragging my raft in its bloody wake. I hung on desperately, cursing in the bitter, stinging spray. Eventually, the shark died. And shortly thereafter stopped swimming. Relief was fleeting, my prospects still dark. The other sharks circled, closer than was comfortable. They worried the morsels from my raft, which I prayed would satisfy them. After eating, they departed, replete. For the moment, I was safe. That night, eating shark, I would have chuckled at the inversion of natural roles had my parched laughter seemed so hateful. My raft grew increasingly grotesque, reflecting my own gradual transformation. With such thoughts to comfort me, I drifted on, mastless into the dawn. Adrift and starving, my darkest imaginings welled up unchecked, spilling from brain to heart like black ink, impossible to remove. I pictured my quiet streets overrun by tattooed fiends. Recalling their brutality, I moaned. The freighter had surely reached home already. My wife was almost certainly dead. These notions transfixed me, stopping time in its tracks. I remembered her waving goodbye from the veranda shadows, sunlight illuminating one cheekbone. Dead. Those glorious days, that innocence. Dead. Dead, I imagined my shipmates' bloated corpses, carrying my raft on fish-eaten backs. Dead, the putrefying shark, its snarl no longer convincing. Dead, I hear her pleading, see their yellowed smiles, their cutlasses carving relentlessly until all her personality, all her subtleties of posture and expression are obliterated, reduced to meat. Dead. Finally, faced with horrors of both intolerable and unavoidable, I chose madness. In my ravings, desperate for company it seemed I conversed with my perished shipmates. Their voices spoke from beneath the raft, thick, bubbling. The conversation of the dead, dreary, bitter, endlessly sad. Interminable bad news from mouths wherein the little fish dart. We talked together, my rotted fellows and I. Of life, and its endings. Of the terrible sentence upon us all. Our damnation, IT-obsessed the sodden dead, dominating their bubbling dialogues. They spoke of a heaven, where once we all lived and died, sentenced for our sins to this pandemonium we call the world. Truly, life is hell and death's rough hand our only deliverance. I could endure no more. Though dreading such a black, breathless end, I leapt, feet first into the horror. Feet first into cold and dank mortality. But the water's surface seemed as stone beneath my timber-blistered soles, and the ocean's depths refused to swallow me. What new torture was this? I stood upon the calm sea, a charnel messiah, unable to sink beneath it to the oblivion I craved. When would my suffering cease? When would death deign to call upon me? Had his terrible shadow passed me by? I lifted my uncomprehending eyes to the heavens, and saw instead the earth. Accustomed to a miserable, shifting landscape of iron green, my mind could not at first grasp the meaning of the sandbar, long and solid. It meant that my lurching journey through darkness was ended. It meant that I had reached my destination. They'd left me for dead, the fiends who doubtless butchered my kin, but now I was returned, upon my corpse boat. A terror they'd imagined themselves safe from. A specter of revenge, riding the flow tide home. I was returned, splashing noisily through the encumbering shallows, sun mulling the horizon behind me, a poker in a glass of sack. I could be no more than 20 miles from home. In broad charcoal strokes, night shaded the sky. I sat amongst skull-colored dunes, sharp grass clinging like hair in black, obstinate tufts. By now, my home was overrun, my family slaughtered. Only revenge remained. Deliberating upon this, I startled at the sound of horses approaching, picking daintily across the shingle, voices, male and female. Huddled in the dune's lap, I watched through a curtain of whispering moraine grass. Dismounting, they tethered their steeds to dark wooden groins, jutting out like charred ribs from the beach. I recognized the man, a moneylender from where I lived. Laughing, he walked his woman over pebbles, down towards the surf. With my home captured, why would brigands allow this scoundrel free passage for his midnight trysts? Had he collaborated? The ribald chuckling reached the water's edge, ceased, became a scream. My raft was discovered. He comforted the weeping, hysterical woman, and my heart grew cold. Was my wife comforted before her execution, while his collaborator and his pirate masters sneered? Now they would report my raft. My decision was hurried, but not difficult. Screaming my hatred, I rushed down the night slope towards them, but all that escaped my lips was the black language of the gulls. Clutching the rock, my hand felt huge, deformed. Startled, they turned. Override. The moneylenders head first with a single blow, exploding as if pressurized by the guild within. Suddenly slick, the rock shot from between my red fingers and was lost. The woman I strangled. This took considerably longer than I had anticipated. At death's approach, all creatures discover an aptitude for violence. Flailing, scratching, she was a briar rose in the wind. The wind dropped. Her thrashings became weaker. The horses watched, understanding only a little. When death was assured, resignation lent her eyes a certain maturity. Thumbs crossed, I closed her windpipe. A buccaneer's whore deserved no pity. Eventually I stood, legs trembling, barely supporting me. In the foam about my ankles, 2 worlds lay ended. My purpose almost forgotten in the giddy whirl of murder itself, I gazed stupidly at the horses. Recovering, I became more rational. Seeking vengeance, might I turn this unforeseen circumstance to my advantage? An idea blossomed, plausible, tempting. The notion fascinated me. It was terrible and yet terribly convenient. This couple left their home unhindered, despite the pirate sentries there must be. They'd be allowed back, also. Tied to her saddle, she looked quite natural. 2 figures had ridden here, now 2 rode back. Soon I would venture amongst evil men, and make them fear me. Unrecognizable in corpse clothing, I was the concealed implement of God's retribution. Abandoning the naked moneylender to the cold surf, I led the horses from the beach. Ahead, my home lay sleeping, little dreaming what approached. Cantering down moonlit lanes, I spied the dark, unmoving form of a pirate sentry, watching sullenly from atop an embankment. I held my breath, dreading lest he should attempt conversation. Trotting unhurriedly to avoid suspicion, I rode past. If he noted the lovers' unusually early return from their assignation, the sentinel said nothing, perhaps assuming we argued. The woman's head lolled stupidly. No living companion was ever so agreeable. I spurred the horses on, whinnying, unnerved by death's scent, towards that inevitable confrontation. Dear God, let me have vengeance, then die swiftly. Delivered at last into the hands of a higher judgment. The people slept, deserted save for silence. Tethering both horses to the veranda, I entered my former residence noiselessly, careful not to rouse the butchers occupying it from their debauched slumber. Unaware that death was amongst them, they'd know its dark embrace without ever understanding why. One, however, was awake. Frantic lest he should raise alarms, I set upon him as he entered the night-wrapped chamber. In cataract darkness, I bludgeoned him, his screams unnervingly shrill. No pirates came, but something worse. I looked up into faces familiar save for their terror. The children wailed. I looked down at the figure beneath me. Through puffed and bloody lips she mouthed my name. There came an understanding so large, it left no room for sanity. As I fled past the mounted cadaver outside, lanterns flared in nearby windows. I ran, but the knowledge of my damnation paced me, gloating, celebrating its awful victory. Eventually I came to an ash-colored shore, a dismal black ocean stretching endless before me. How had I reached this appalling position, with love, only love, as my guide? Behind me, distantly, a lynch mob howled. The moneylender floated at my feet. Noble intentions had led me to atrocity. The righteous, awful scheme was but delusion. Where was my error? The freighter was heading for home. It should have already arrived. My deduction was flawless, step by step. Pausing, I stood panting, sobbing, listening to the wind-borne sound of my pursuers, closer now as breath returned. Planning to resume my flight, I raised my head. And saw her. She seemed to be waiting, not hovering to strike. Gradually, I understood what innocent intent had brought me to, and, understanding, waited out beyond my depth. The unspeakable truth loomed unavoidably before me as I swam towards the anchored freighter, waiting to take extra hands aboard. There'd been no plan to capture my home. What could a mortal town offer those who'd reaped the wealth of the Sargasso? The ship was larger nearer. I kept swimming. All my well-meaning plans had come to this. I choked, spat out brine and struck grimly on. They'd come here to wait until they could collect the only prize they'd ever valued, claim the only soul they'd ever truly wanted. My shoulders ached. The ship was massive now. Its dark and lurching mass filled my vision. I saw the heads nailed to its prow, heard drunken laughter, encouragement sparked from the decks above. Closer, it came. Closer. The world I'd tried to was lost beyond recall. I was a horror, amongst horrors I must dwell. A rope snaked down. Spluttering, I grabbed it. And from the decks above a cheer went up, both gross and black, its stench affronting heaven.